For some analysis now, we're joined by Andrew Levy, Labour analyst, who's going to tell us a little bit more about this standoff between Amcu and the NUM. Andrew, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. This manifestation of inter-union conflict, is it something new, or is it something that we've seen before?
Oh, we've seen it before for a long, long time, particularly between these two players. Let me make a general comment to begin with. And that is that of all the things that management has to deal with, inter-union rivalry, inter-union disputes, the most difficult, because the issue giving rise to the dispute is beyond management's control. So it's very difficult for them to influence the outcome. There has been a huge increase in inter-union disputes over the last 4 or 5 years in South Africa because there's been a whole rush of new unions emerging. But if we look at the two giants of mining, NUM and Amcu, the rivalry is not new. Now, if we look historically, the older of the two, the senior citizen, is NUM. It goes back to the 80s, early 80s, when Cyril Ramaphosa cut his teeth as the first general secretary of that union and built it into a formidable force. But at a later stage, there was a fallout amongst the leadership. And we're talking about the early to middle 2000s here. And one of the organizers in NUM, a certain gentleman called Joseph Matunjwa, was actually expelled. And as a result of which, he said, well, if that's the case, I'm going to start my own union, which he did. And that was Amcu. Now, it originally grew in the Witbank area in coal mining and construction, but gradually began to spread its wings.
Yeah.
Now, NUM, as the established union, not only had existing recognition agreements and bargaining rights with various large mining companies throughout the mining spectrum, but in some cases it also had a closed shop agreement, which means that the union has a monopoly, and if you want to work there, you've either got to join the union or allow a particular deduction to be made.
Right.
So we have a situation where they are established, as it were, with the force of agreement and law behind them.
Yeah.
And now we have the maverick coming along, Amcu, and Amcu directed its whole recruiting strategy at workers on the ground. And I think that at that stage, the workers on the ground felt that the NUM leadership were too cozy with management, they were living the good life, and they'd forgotten where their membership interests lay. Now, every union wants to protect its membership for the simple reason that every member pays its dues, and that, of course, is the source of revenue for the union. So these turf wars emerge. What I would just say in finality at this moment, before I hand it back to you, is that I don't believe for a moment that this is something which was promoted and urged and started by Amcu. And I don't think it's a sit-in. I think it's a hostage situation. And in many ways, it echoes the dysfunctionality and the distressing state of our labor relations. And what we're seeing, once again, is a small minority dominating a large majority.
All right, I'm going to come to that dysfunction of our labor relations system. But why did we? Because they are telling us and leading us to believe, and I don't have a reason to believe otherwise, that this fight is about the monopoly bargaining power. It is about the majoritarian principle that South Africa labor regime is currently applying. Why did we opt for that? Because I believe in the UK they've got the all-comers principle that is in application. It's the United States, it's Canada, and I don't know, some other countries, or New Zealand, I think, is on that list, that is going with this exclusive representation regime.
You know, by and large, my own view is that the bargaining rights for the majority union is a better system than all comers. But the trick is what happens when the existing union loses support. How do you exit that agreement and slot into the new one? And that is where the current impasse is. Now, our Labour Relations Act provides a methodology, a legal way to do it, and it involves a notice period, and it involves a ballot to see who has the majority. But I think that there is an impatience on the shop floor, and the hotheads, so to speak, have taken over. And, the company got a court order yesterday, but frankly, they might as well have engaged a musician to play his pipe and hope that the strikers would follow him out. I mean, what are you going to do 1,000 feet underground, waving a piece of paper at a group of militant shop stewards who are trying to press a point and say, the court says you must come out? It's not going to work. And one of the reasons it won't work is because, terribly sadly, both in our labour relations and in many areas of our larger society, there is no respect for the rule of the law. People are not concerned. I want what I want it now. And we still have a situation where a small number can influence a large number. Now, all this is hard enough if you're sitting in a factory. But if you are 5,000 feet underground, where there's limited access, where there's limited mobility, where at this stage there appears to be no broad communication, where it's easy to hold people against their will, what are you going to do? Because if you send in force, then you're going to end up with a Marikana-type situation. So as far as management is concerned, the best thing they can do is sit and wait. Now, it would be nice if Amcu went down themselves and said to their members, guys, comply with the court order. Guys, use the democratic method. If we're the majority, we'll get it. But unfortunately, we've not reached the stage in our labour relations where our unions are either mature enough to say to their members, you're wrong, or they don't feel safe enough to say that. So this is a fairly deeply entrenched problem, and it does, you're quite right, derive from the majoritarian principle, but there are checks and balances and ways to resolve that, but they do take some time.
Yeah. Why do you think the inter-union competition is not going to work in South Africa, especially if you look, for example, in the instance that you've just made now, that NUM began to have this discriminatory behavior of saying, well, it's either you're part of this union or you don't work here, which I'm sure is not supported by our constitution. I know elsewhere in the world, if not in the United States, those agency fees are actually been ruled by the court as being wrong, and they shouldn't be charged for non-union members. But it seems here in South Africa that has been allowed. And many people say, well, the reason why we go to unions as employees is to be able to negotiate wages, benefits, working hours, schedules, training, dispute resolutions, and things like that. And it's a give and take. So we can't really have a one-size-fits-all approach, which is now currently in place if you have this majoritarian regime.
For whatever reason, the drafters of the LRA kept the closed shop provision, and I suspect it was to, one, try and entrench the position of some of the existing craft unions, organizing the more highly skilled workers, but also to give the emerging black unions the comfort that if they became the majority, they could rule the roost. Fact of the matter is that if you look at the 21st century, the closed shop is something that goes back to the early to middle 20th century, and it really has no place in the existing scheme of labor relations. But unfortunately, it does require a certain degree of tolerance and sophistication, which at this stage, we don't seem to have. And for the same reason, and let me say this is my view, and I'm certainly not a political scientist, far from it, but I don't believe there's much of a future at this stage for coalition politics in South Africa for the same reasons that there isn't a room for a sort of all-comers cooperative situation with our unions. Now, there are mechanisms in the Labour Relations Act which allow it, but as long as the unions refuse to sit down with one another, and always, let's remember, what is the turf war about? It's about their income. Now, they're not inclined to share that. So, as I said earlier on, the overall losers in this are, one, management, and two, the majority of workers, in my view, who want nothing more than to come to work and do a day's work and get a day's pay. So, it is an unhappy situation, but to blame the law or to blame the structure of the system, I think is not quite correct.
Yeah.
I think one must simply say it's the players who could make a better job of what we have.
Did AMCU make a run for NUM members? Is it a raid, or are the members themselves voting with their feet? And is NUM asleep to this decline?
If you look at the emergence of AMCU and the rivalry between the two of them, there's no question. NUM was asleep on the job, and AMCU stole a march by getting in and saying, guys, we're here, we're at shop floor level, we're fighting for you. And the next thing, they looked round, and if you take the platinum industry, there was a mass desertion from NUM. And ultimately, the Marikana disaster had its roots in this rivalry, and was certainly, and I'm going to be critical here, was aided and abetted by some of the managements who said, we can't talk to you, AMCU, because we have a recognition agreement with NUM. As opposed to saying, if all of our workers want AMCU to speak to them, AMCU, we want to hear what you've got to say. So, ultimately that led to, indirectly, the 5-month strike and the terrible consequences of that. But AMCU certainly raided the NUM membership, and remember that AMCU was started in a sense as a breakaway by an ex-NUM official. So that official knew the characters, he knew the weaknesses, he knew the organizing strategy, and had an appealing message for the workers.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to talk a little bit about that employer flexibility. But would you say the employer flexibility would only end there at saying, well, let's just hear the other side? It seems AMCU is saying, well, they could have played a little bit more of a role now, maybe even in expediting the recognition of AMCU as the majority.
Look, obviously the role of unions is to criticize management. And that is what they're going to do. And management will counterclaim by saying, well, we are limited by the law, and in any event, your guys took the law into their own hands. This is an unlawful strike, and there we are. But, it is quite possible, and indeed it is quite probable, that management could have perhaps acted sooner when they saw the drift taking place, and tried to take active steps to prevent it coming to this pass. But I will say one thing, and that is that all sit-ins or occupations, whether they're at the top of a skyscraper or at the bottom of a mine, always come to an end. People get tired, they want to go home, the conditions are unsanitary, they're unpleasant, they haven't got their comfortable beds to sleep in, they get tired of singing, and sooner or later it will end. And in order to avoid a tragic outcome, the best thing that management can do is to sit and to wait. And certainly, were private security or the police to go in, I think it would be a really, really unfortunate situation. So in many respects, the demand from the workers is we want sort of instant recognition.
Yeah.
They're not going to get it.
Right.
And there is a process in place. And what NUMCU should be, what AMCU, not NUMCU, that's a hybrid. What AMCU should be saying to its members is, guys, come up, we'll sort this thing out, let's follow the procedures. But I don't know that any of our unions have enough backbone to turn around to their members and say, guys, you're wrong, now give this up.
Right.
And particularly in these circumstances, it's a serious safety hazard.
Andrew, let's leave it there. Much appreciated. Labor analyst Andrew Levy, appreciate it.
Certainly with pleasure. Thank you. Good night.
That one, that standoff between Amcu and NUM at that mine in Ekurhuleni. We'll continue in a moment. Stay with us.